Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Let's get to our top story tonight. A high-ranking Iranian nuclear physicist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated in an ambush near Iran's capital, Tehran, on November 27th. Fakhrizadeh Mahabadi was a brigadier general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an academic physicist, and a senior official in Iran's nuclear program. According to open sources, he led Iran's Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research and the Green Salt Project. There are different details of how his vehicle was intercepted and how he was killed. But what is clear is that the assassins were highly trained and knew their target's movement in real time. According to one assessment, the hit squad had also hacked the IRGC's communications network, which is how his movement could be tracked. Iran is already accused of Israel's Mossad for planning and executing the op. This would fit in with previous hits on Iranian physicists between 2010 and 2012. 4 Iranian scientists were killed and 1 wounded in hits within Iran. According to multiple stories in the Western press, U.S. intelligence reportedly confirmed the Israeli connection, and this is with reference to previous hits. News reports also suggested that Mossad was employing Mujahideen-e-Khalq activists for the hits. Israel has never confirmed or denied its role, but its then Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon is reported to have said that, and I quote from what he said, "We will act in any way and are not willing to tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran," unquote. Additionally, the US and Israel launched the Stuxnet virus attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. Analysts believe the cyber attack set Iran's nuclear program back by several years. To discuss this development in the backdrop of shifting regional and global alliances, and considering that this is an act of provocation, we are joined by Syed Marandi, an Iranian-American academic and political scientist, and Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Director of Analytical Development at the Center for Global Policy. Let me begin with Mr. Marandi here. Mr. Marandi, even a 2011, this was November 2011 IAEA report, referred to Mr. Fakhrizadeh and identified him as a key figure in weaponizing Iran's nuclear program. And this was also reported by Reuters, which referred to the story. I mean, the story was captioned, "UN nuclear report puts Iran's mystery man in spotlight." So it seems that Mr. Fakhrizadeh was a very important man within as far as the development of the nuclear program is concerned.
Well, a couple of things. One is that there is no evidence that Iran's military communications were hacked. And in addition to that, I should add that by no means has the Iranian nuclear program been set back by years by any attack carried out by the United States. Parts of the program were delayed perhaps by months, but it would be an exaggeration to say the program was set back years. With regards to the accusations made by the IAEA, we all know the influence that the United States has and had on that organization. And just like the United States forced the OPCW to take a position on Iraq under Saddam Hussein before the US invasion, and when it resisted, they had the head of the OPCW, the Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons, or the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the head of that organization, they forced his removal. So we know the power of the United States in coming up with these statements. But after all these years, there's no evidence whatsoever that Iran ever made a move towards a militarization of its nuclear program. The Ministry of Defense has a significant role to play because Iran is sanctioned. And since Iran is sanctioned, many projects in this country are not being carried out by the private sector or international investors. And therefore, they are involved. And that is why Mr. Fakhrizadeh was both involved with the nuclear program, but he was also involved in Iran's research and development of the COVID-19 vaccine. So that is the role that he and the military plays. The Americans know this, the Europeans know this, but the Iranian nuclear program is used as an excuse to keep Iran back, because they know that a strong and independent Iran could be a very bad sign for U.S. and Western hegemony across the world.
Right. But, I, of course, was referring to what the analysts say. It wasn't my point of view. And, of course, Iran has its own point of view, which you have expressed here. But earlier, as we know, Major General Qasem Soleimani was assassinated. Now we have this. General Soleimani was assassinated in Iraq. Mr. Fakhrizadeh, fairly close to Tehran. So there seems to be, and their movements obviously were being tracked real time, and the intelligence was actionable. So that does seem to indicate some kind of breach within the communications network or somewhere which allowed the assassins or the hit squads, in one case the drone and in another case a hit squad, to take out Mr. Fakhrizadeh or Major General Qasem Soleimani. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, these are two separate events. General Soleimani was flying on an international flight from Damascus to Baghdad in Iraq, and he was going to meet the Iraqi prime minister. So it wasn't a secret flight. And he is a senior Iranian government and military official. So it was an official invitation by the Iraqi prime minister, who wanted to meet with him about some sort of rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't difficult for the Americans to access the information about his movements between Syria and Iraq. But this attack on General Fakhrizadeh is different, and I agree that a great deal of intelligence was gathered and a sophisticated operation was carried out. But that doesn't mean that the Revolutionary Guard's communication systems were hacked. It could have meant many different things. And as the current investigation is moving forward, we are having updates in what the narrative of what actually happened. So without a doubt, espionage was carried out. Without a doubt, the United States, the Israelis, and perhaps third parties were involved in this attack. We can tell from Trump's retweets, from the information that U.S. officials gave to the New York Times. It's clear that the Israelis had U.S. support on this. But exactly what happened remains to be seen. But the Iranians will have no option but to, A, retaliate in kind, and B, Iran will drastically reduce its commitments to the nuclear deal, the remaining commitments, and they will also decrease its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So the retaliation against the Israeli regime will obviously be lethal. The retaliation against the United States will mean decreased cooperation on the nuclear file.
Right, very interesting. I will get back to this, but I want to find out, there are reportedly 4 people whose pictures have been put out by the Iranian government, and they are supposed to be part of the hit squad. So all 4, are they part of the MEK, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq group?
At the moment, we don't know what happened. The government is being very quiet. There are some narratives that have been put out by some of the media which are conflicting, and some of it may just to get more hits by these media outlets, and some of it may just be information and misinformation by the government that is intentional to help them with investigation. So at the moment, I have no idea if there really was anyone at the scene, because one of the narratives is that it was done without any individual being at the scene, and that technology, the new technologies were used to carry out the attack. That's one narrative. Again, we have to wait and see what what ultimately comes out from the Iranian intelligence report. But the head of the Iranian Supreme National Security Council has said specifically that he is certain that the Mujahideen Khalq carried out the operation. The Mujahideen Khalq is a terrorist organization and cult which has killed 17,000 Iranians through bomb attacks and assassinations. They fought alongside Saddam Hussein, and now they are protected by the West, and they're funded by them. They have a military base in Albania, and they have offices in capitals across Europe and North America. So the MEK, for your audience, is the equivalent of Osama bin Laden for the United States, although they helped create Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, as you know quite well, or Abu Bakr Baghdadi for the Syrian people in Iraq, which again, Abu Bakr Baghdadi was a creation that the Americans intelligence alongside the Israelis helped to bring about and create.
Right. Final question, Mr. Marandi. You might have seen John Brennan's very interesting tweet with reference to the assassination, which he called a grave act of provocation. It seems to me that he was indicating, and in that tweet he also advised Iran to be patient. It seems to me that, I don't know if that's your impression also, but it seems to me that he was saying, well, you know, there is a transition going to happen, and perhaps Iran should be patient. And I say this with reference to what you said about, you know, pulling back from the JCPOA and so on and so forth. Is that something that Iran would consider, or do you think the three options that you talked about earlier are the options that Iran will carry out, regardless of the political transition in the United States?
Yes, I think what he said is accurate, and the Israeli regime wants to bring about a provocation. But the Iranians have no option but to respond. They will decrease their commitments to the nuclear deal. And of course, we have to remember that it's only the Iranians who are abiding by its commitments. The Europeans and the Americans are abiding by none of their commitments. The Iranians have quit abiding by 60% of their commitments. And now the remaining 40%, of course, it's subjective, but the remaining, let's say, 40% will probably be decreased or stopped altogether. So it's not as if Iran is doing something or reducing commitments while the Americans and the Europeans are abiding by theirs.
Right.
The second point is that
go on.
The Iranians will wait for the United States to act. If Biden wants to implement the nuclear deal, then the Iranians are fine with that. He can do it easily. All he has to do is reverse the presidential decrees by Trump, and he will have already gone most of the way. So that is one separate file. If the United States changes course, implements the deal, something which it never did actually under Obama. It never fulfilled its obligations. But if it fulfills its obligations this time around, then the Iranians have said they will fulfill their obligations within the nuclear deal.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Syed Mohammad Marandi speaking with us. Let me go straight to Kamran Bokhari. Kamran, you've been listening to this, and I know this is stuff that's straight down your alley. Starting with just the sort of the operational side of it, and then, you know, we can expand to the political strategic side of it. Purely operationally speaking, it you know, sort of looks kind of, or sounds incredulous that without actually hacking into the communications network of IRGC, that the hit squad could have information, real-time information on the movement of General Fakhrizadeh. What do you make of it?
You're right. I mean, there's just no way around that. Look, what the Iranians will say or will not say, obviously, will be a political decision in terms of how much they release of the operational details once they've completed their investigation. But that's sort of a separate thing. The reality is, look, you cannot undertake this kind of operation without real good intelligence, real-time intelligence, as you put it, and people on the ground, human resources, who know who's moving from where and when, schedules. This was, timed. I mean, if you look at just the details that are coming out, it shows that the people were in place. So let's sort of look at this and say, who recruited them? How did they get recruited? Why are people inside Iran who know that they could, pay with their lives if they participated in an act like that? What was their motivation? Is it purely financial, or is it ideological? Is it both? This is an elaborate process. We have a foreign intelligence service. In this case, it's increasingly looking like it is the Israeli Mossad, having access to people inside Iran. That's incredible. We're talking about a state that is obsessed with spies, that puts, people who are prominent journalists and have dual citizenship with Iran and the United States, and Iran and Canada and the UK in jail. They're always looking for spies. And we know that the Iranian tradecraft, in terms of managing intelligence assets, their assets across the region, from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Yemen and other places, is extensive. So for a state like that, which has that kind of sophisticated operations in terms of military operations and intelligence operations, for them to be penetrated like that is huge.
Absolutely, I actually agree with you. And also, regardless of, as I said, the different and differing sort of versions of how this happened, one thing is clear, that the hit squad was highly trained, and that kind of training does not happen within a matter of 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. I mean, it takes a long time. So these assets obviously, had been trained, possibly outside Iran, and then reinducted into Iran. And as you mentioned, given Iran's own extensive intelligence network and proxy network in the region, it's really absolutely, in terms of intelligence term, it's a coup for a state to be able to do that.
And I mean, if you think about it, we have an insurgency in Iran, if I may be allowed to sort of go to that level. There's an insurgency underway, because if you look at the half a dozen mysterious explosions that took place during the summer, in various cities across Iran, we know that scientists have been targeted before. We have this, and then the elimination of a senior Al-Qaeda leader back in August, of which we learned only 2 weeks ago. All of this means that there is a broad network of assets in country, whether they're being trained in country or whether it's partly outside and partly inside. Regardless of those details, you have a foreign intelligence service being able to operate undetected by one of the most highly securitized state in the world. I mean, if you look at the layers of security forces, you have local police, you have what they call Naja, which is the law enforcement agencies of the Islamic Republic. You have Basij, you have the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, you have the IRGC actively taking a role in domestic security since 2009. And then IRGC has its own parallel intelligence service called, IRGC Ittalaat. And so all this infrastructure is on one side, and these people are allowed to operate. So this isn't like a small operation. It is a widespread insurgency, or at least the early signs of an insurgency, where there are enough people disgruntled with the regime willing to do business with foreign intelligence services.
Right. But I have another thought also, and I want to get your take on it. It seems to me that, technically speaking, if you expand the number of activists, then given the logistics, communications among them, and so on and so forth, there can always be a slip-up. It seems to me that, regardless of the activism outside of the main cities, this particular cadre is not only highly trained, both in intelligence and counterintelligence. But the numbers are not very large, which seems to me to be one of the reasons that they've managed to elude this multi-layered intelligence and security structure that you talked about.
Totally. That's a great point. By design, the number of operatives. So let's distinguish between the potential sort of pool of dissidents and the operatives who carry out these acts. That's a small subset, and by design, because you don't want too many people in that space with too much information. I think it's highly compartmentalized. It's on a need-to-know basis. People, if we think of it in terms of lateral cells or multi-layered cells, there is no, horizontal and vertical communication. I think pretty much all the best practices that we've seen in recent decades in terms of intelligence operations are being adhered to here, because there's a great possibility of a slip-up, as you said, and one slip-up can unravel the entire network. So I think anyone who's leading this operation is a highly trained professional. They're highly trained professionals, and they're using the best possible tradecraft and the best practices in this field.
Absolutely. One final question, Kamran. You heard Mohammad Marandi talk about Iran's lethal retaliation against Israel. Then, of course, as far as the U.S. is concerned, the JCPOA, and then also the third aspect that you talked about. So give me your reading of those three areas that he covered, and what possibly could it do with reference to use of lethal force against Israel? Would it be Hezbollah sort of firing rockets into northern Israel? Would it be this kind of operation within Israel? What exactly could there be?
A couple of things, Ijaz. So first of all, the strategic conundrum that the Iranians find themselves in is how do they retaliate against Israel while not disrupting the potential for a new nuclear deal with the incoming Biden administration. Those are two things that have to be balanced. They're two separate imperatives. And I think that is sort of something that they've not really figured out just yet. They're looking at, the Supreme National Security Council, where everybody's a part of, whether it's the executive branch, the clerics, the IRGC, the Ministry of Defense. They're all sort of debating at this point. If I was a fly, on their wall, I'd love to be. It's the best intelligence right now you could have.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah. So they are debating. Well, how do we do this now? They're looking at I suspect that the generals are coming up with contingency plans, and they're saying, okay, we can do X, Y, Z. Now, in terms of your second question, what can they do against Israel? So yes, Hezbollah is one of sort of the obvious assets that they could use, maybe fire rockets into Israel. I think that a terrorist attack inside Israel is far more difficult, as we've seen, the Israelis have been able to sort of clamp down on those networks. And quite frankly, if they hadn't, we'd still be seeing suicide bombings by Hamas operatives or PIJ operatives. But I think that's not going to happen. I think what likely is an external attack using rockets, or perhaps using rockets based in Gaza. Now, but the Iranians know that the Israelis have gamed this out. So the Israelis are not undertaking these operations thinking that there won't be a retaliation. So they've already factored that in, and they have planned accordingly. So the challenge for the Iranians is even greater, is that the Israelis are a couple of steps ahead of them at this stage. And so they have to come up with some way, again, do it in which, the Israeli counterattack, because the Israelis will also do a counterattack. So that's the other missing piece of the puzzle that we're not talking about just yet. It's not an Iranian retaliation, but what's the counter retaliation from Israel? Then how do you keep the U.S. on one side?
Correct. Stay with me, Kamran. Let me also pull in Ali Sultan, who has joined me. Ali is a lawyer and expert in international law and also consults for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ali, thank you for being on the program. As you know, we're discussing General Fakhrizade's assassination. So give us the international law perspective on this. There were earlier sort of reports back in 2010, 2012, with this Iranian physicist being assassinated. Fingers were being pointed towards Mossad. There's obviously the issue of plausible deniability. So what are Iran's options here as far as the legal side is concerned?
Thank you for having me, first of all, Ijaz. Well, first of all, the challenge for Iran right now is to first somehow find a way of attributing this act to the state of Israel. Only once this action could be attributed to Israel would any legal consequences then flow thereupon. So that's the first challenge. And attribution is all the more perhaps difficult here because that zone of plausible deniability, I think intentionally and very much by design here, is pretty expansive, given that they've used, by all accounts, they've used no human agency here, at least on the ground, when this attack took place. So attribution here might be a problem to begin with. But if we assume that the Israeli footprint is behind this attack, then this is an absolute brazen assault on the fundamental notions of international law, including state sovereignty and respect for each other's, sovereignty and territorial integrity. And more so, this would be considered an extrajudicial assassination, an extrajudicial targeted killing, which is squarely unlawful under international law. It could also be considered an aggressive use of force, which is a violation of the United Nations Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4. And of course, it would completely offend the international covenant on civil and political right and the right to life, which is guaranteed to all individuals. Because remember, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, at the end of the day, was a civilian public official of the Iranian government. He was not even a military target. So there really is no justification for this attack under international law once that attribution has been established.
Right.
So that's
Fakhrizadeh was, according to reports, Brigadier General in the IRGC. But so Ali, quickly tell me, if all other things being equal, if there can be an attribution, what kind of forums could the Iranian government use or pray to with reference to this?
Look, as you know, Ijaz, it's very difficult to bring legal claims in international tribunals because most of them require consent, one form or the other, from the states. That's why it will be very difficult to bring this to some established international tribunal. But nevertheless, Iran can and probably will raise it at the United Nations and also before the United Nations Human Rights Council, because the attack on another similar target, General Soleimani, a few months ago in January, that has actually been classified as violation of international law by one of the special procedures mandate holders of the Human Rights Council, which is the special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings. So that's another forum where Iran might want to try its luck.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Ali Sultan speaking with me. Let me quickly go back to Kamran Bokhari before I wrap up this segment. Kamran, Iran obviously under sanctions. Iranian Air Force is vintage. Is not even anywhere close to what the UAE can field, let alone the Israelis. The mainstay of any Iranian offensive capability are the Iranian missiles. They've been working on, improving the CEP, which they have. But there are no strategic warheads. So with tactical warheads, how much damage can Iran actually do unless It's using firing redundancy and then of course there are the ballistic missile defenses, the Iron Dome and the rest of it. I'm not particularly keen on the Patriots that the Gulfies have, but the fact is, and the Iranians could use decoys. But so give me a sense of this whole talk about a strike against Iran. What are Iran's options, and how well do you think it could use them?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we have in terms of a challenge, both for Iran to use conventional military means to retaliate against what is an intelligence operation, is sheer distance. We're talking 1,200 miles. That's a large distance. There is no evidence. We've not seen them in active battle situations, how they've performed. They have an array of missiles. There's a lot of open source information out there. The Iranians parade them, but we've not really seen them in action. We've seen some tests and some footage. I suspect the Defense Intelligence Agency at the Pentagon has a good sense of what they're like, because they're monitoring this through satellites and whatnot whenever they do these tests. But beyond that, we don't have any confirmed operational performance metrics in terms of how they can actually be deployed. We have to assume that they can strike across the Persian Gulf, but then that would be a level of escalation in response to this situation that's just too much. In fact, I would say that the Iranians using conventional military means to attack Israel directly will also be an escalation that they don't want to go to just yet. They didn't do that when Soleimani was killed. And if you look at the rhetoric is a bit different. After Soleimani was killed, pretty much the entire leadership was, basically in very sharp bellicose rhetoric mood, saying revenge is coming and whatnot. This time it's muted. I mean, and because it's the timing. At that time, they thought that, President Trump would perhaps get reelected. This was January of last year. Right now, we have a new president coming in. So the Iranians, you have to assume everybody's a rational actor. Do they want a new nuclear deal that can solve a lot of their core problems with respect to sanctions relief, or do they want to have a revenge? If they want revenge, it could always be done at a later time, or they may do a revenge.
In fact, this is the strategic conundrum that you were talking about. Unfortunately, I've run out of time. Thank you so much, Kamran Bokhari, for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Afghan peace talks. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about a New York Times report which suggests that President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan has refused to let peace talks move forward, even though the Taliban and government negotiators have reached a tentative agreement on the guiding principles. Earlier, reports suggested that the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban had agreed on procedural rules for peace talks to end the conflict. Taliban spokesman Mohammad Naeem said on Twitter that the terms, which consist of 21 articles, have been approved by both parties to break weeks of stalemate. The Afghan government has pushed back, saying no such agreement has been reached. A key disagreement has been whether the US-Taliban deal should serve as the basis for the Afghan-Taliban talks, a position rejected by the government. To discuss the situation further, we have with us Rahimullah Yusufzai, a resident editor of The News, and Arif Rafiq, non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and president, Vizier Consulting. Let me begin with Mr. Rafiq here. Mr. Rafiq, referring back to the Times story, it's pretty at one level, it kind of gives a sense that the one who's throwing a spanner in the works is President Ashraf Ghani.
Yeah, I think that is very much the case, and that is, evident from this Times report and also from the developments over the past year. These intra-Afghan talks were supposed to have begun in March, several weeks after the United States and the Taliban concluded their agreement in Doha. But it took 6 months for these talks to kick off, and it's taken an additional 2 months or so for this framework agreement to be sealed. The president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, has the most to lose from forward progress in these peace talks as they're presently presently formed, because they'll most likely require that he relinquish power and give power to some sort of interim government, or give up a large swath or a large amount of his powers. So right now we see some disagreement over the preamble, how the different parties are being referred to. According to the Afghan government, they just released a statement today that there has been agreement on 21 articles of this framework, guiding framework, but that there remains disagreement on the preamble. And I think for the Ghani government, there's also a potential loss of legitimacy. They'd like to continue to be recognized as the legitimate elected government of Afghanistan, and if they are characterized in any other way in this framework, it diminishes their standing and pretty much makes them the equivalent of the Taliban.
Right. I'm happy you referred to the interim government setup, because, as you recall, after the February signing of the deal, there was some analyses talked about the possibility of an interim government, succeeding the Intra-Afghan talks. And there was immediate pushback from the president's office. So do you think that President Ghani thinks that while the talks should go forward, but that should be contingent upon the fact that he gets to finish his term, and everything else, in terms of power sharing and the rest of it, comes after his term comes to an end? I mean, I'm speculating, but I just want to get your view on that.
That's not his publicly stated goal, but I do think that he aspires to serve his entire term. What we've seen from Ghani's previous term as president is that he's in a constant state of balancing. He makes these agreements with various power brokers in the country, breaks them, and then makes new agreements with other competitors. And so, this is sort of the Game of Thrones that has been taking place during Ghani's tenure, and also preceding him as well. And so, right now, I think he's just thinking about buying himself, short periods of time, months or, 6 months, half a year. He tried to sort of survive the sort of the latter year of the Trump administration. Now he's likely thinking about the transition period and the initial few months of the Biden administration. So I think he's thinking in shorter periods, but his aspiration is likely to continue to serve as president until his term ends. Right.
Final question, Mr. Rafiq. As you know, Prime Minister Imran Khan was in Kabul, actually his maiden visit to Kabul, and Pakistan and Afghanistan also signed a vision document. Prime Minister Khan also talked about facilitating the talks and helping reduce violence. How does all that fit in with, what the Times says about President Ghani's approach to the talks?
Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the region. And so the Kabul government, as well as Imran Khan's government in Islamabad, they're pursuing all options. So we also saw that Dr. Abdullah, who is the head of the National Reconciliation Council in Afghanistan, also recently visited Islamabad. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the former sort of favorite insurgent leader of Pakistan, had also visited. So, and then we see also, various power brokers in Afghanistan have visited New Delhi. So there is, all sides are kind of expanding their options and pursuing their hedging. And so that's a strategy that we see in Islamabad and Kabul, and perhaps even we'll see that in Washington.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Arif Rafiq speaking with us. Let me go to Rahimullah Yusufzai. Mr. Yusufzai, you are obviously a very keen observer of Afghanistan and have been for a very long time. Give me your reading of this New York Times story, and what options do you think President Ghani has?
Yes, I believe that the story is correct. We have seen this not recently, but for some time now. President Ashraf Ghani actually is a hurdle now in the peace process. It's rather strange that the spokesman of the Kabul negotiating team, Nader Nadri, is saying, yes, there was an agreement on the 21 points of the rules of procedure, but he says that we have to agree on the opening statement, or you can say the preamble.
Yes.
That's a bit strange because, as Taliban are claiming that this agreement was reached on 15th of November. On 17th, this agreement copies were made, and one of the copies was given to the host country, Qatar. So the agreement is there now. There are 3 copies, I think, with the Afghan government, with Taliban, and with Qatar. And Qatar is a witness because the agreement was read out and both sides agreed. Now, the introduction of the preamble, that's not going to take time, but, Nadri and another negotiator from Kabul, Hafiz Mansour, is also saying there was a conditional agreement. So I think he also refers to this preamble. Now, the Afghan government stand is that this agreement should also mention that the UN Security Council recognizes the Afghan government as a legitimate government. And he also wants the Loe Jirga resolutions to be made part of this, statement or preamble or whatever. This is something which can be discussed when they start the formal talks, because this is just the rules of procedure, the basic framework. Now they are going to have an agenda and they can talk on all these issues. But I think, as I was saying earlier also in the beginning, that it is in the interest of President Ashraf Ghani to prolong the peace talks so that he can remain in power. He was hoping that, Trump will lose and Joe Biden will win. But I think Joe Biden is not going to drastically change the policy. He's also going to continue withdrawing his forces. So I think Ashraf Ghani is now clutching his straws. He wants to remain in power, whatever may happen, but he thinks he is the legitimate president, and Taliban, as one of the parties, should seek some concessions from him. That sort of agreement, I think, he is seeking.
Right. So how are, because President Ashraf Ghani is not the only political player in Kabul, although he is the president and therefore a very important and perhaps the most important political player. But there are others in the opposition, politics. Taliban have bilaterally been approaching lots of leaders also, including Hikmatyar and Dostum and others. So what do you think, if this becomes clear that President Ghani is trying to unnecessarily prolong this process so that he stays in power, how are these other political players going to react to that?
Ashraf Ghani very cleverly included all these opposition figures or their relations or their nominees in the negotiating team, which is 20-member. And although this is being led by his men, Masoom Stanakzai and Abdul Salam Rahimi, they are the ones who represent the president. So he's controlling the process, but I think that, he has to also listen to the opposition. And these opposition figures, we are now hearing, Taliban are claiming that actually there's a split in the negotiating team which came from Kabul. And some of them, they say that, yes, we have reached an agreement and understanding, and that should be followed. They want to continue with the talks. So I think, this may happen now or in future. There's going to be a split. I think that, Abdullah is more, I must say, forthcoming. Abdullah, he's leading the peace process. And now, under the pressure of the US, European countries, the British government, finally, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah have met, and after 3 months delay, they have agreed to constitute the executive committee of the High Council for National Reconciliation, about 30 to 35 members. And that is going to lead the process, the peace process, because they don't want Ashraf Ghani to interfere in everything. He is the president. He is the final authority, but I think Abdullah, under the power sharing agreement, is the head of the High Council for National Reconciliation, and he is going to have this executive committee, and they will actually lead the peace process. So I think that is going to happen now after this meeting between Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, and after the intervention of Hamid Karzai and Professor Sayyaf, who actually were instrumental in making possible the power sharing agreement. So I think things are moving towards that end. The peace process cannot stop now. The peace talks will continue. Ashraf Ghani, as he has been doing before this, in every issue, he will have to retreat. He will have to accept some kind of a rule of procedure so that the talks can proceed further.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Rahimullah Yusufzai speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.